We stand on the brink of a story hidden in plain sight, a story older than the written word itself. Tonight, we'll uncover a fragment of ancient history that has shaped the very foundation of our understanding of civilization, the Sumerian King List, a document that, at first glance, might seem like nothing more than a dry list of rulers. But buried within its lines are revelations that question the very nature of humanity's origins. Did gods rule before humans? Could this ancient text hold the answers to the mysteries of our distant past? Before we dive deeper, take a moment to like this video and let us know where you're listening from. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep unraveling these ancient mysteries together. The King List itself is one of the oldest surviving records of human civilization, etched into clay by scribes who knew their history was far more than just a list of kings. It was a document that defined power, lineage, and divine authority. For the Sumerians, kings weren't just rulers, they were divine beings, chosen by the gods themselves to lead the people. And these gods weren't abstract forces. They were real, tangible entities that shaped the lives of humans in ways we can barely comprehend today. Now think about this. These kings, many of whom ruled for thousands of years, seem to exist in a world where time itself bends. The King List starts with rulers who are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. These are not just powerful kings. They are described as beings who lived beyond the human lifespan, whose rule extended far past what we could fathom today. But something shifts after the flood, a global catastrophe that is mentioned in every ancient civilization. After the flood, the reigns of kings become more in line with our current understanding of time. So what does this mean? Is the King List a historical document? Or is it a carefully crafted myth designed to link Sumerian rulers to divine power? To answer this, we must go beyond the clay tablets and look at the broader picture of Sumerian culture, religion, and even astronomy. The Sumerians believed that their kings were not just chosen by the gods, but that their divine bloodline connected them directly to these powerful beings from the heavens. In the beginning, the King List speaks of rulers like Alulim, who is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Alulim was the first king of Eridu, the first city ever founded according to the Sumerians. He was not just a man, he was a god king, but as time moves on, something profound happens. The reigns of kings shrink from tens of thousands of years to just a few centuries, and eventually we see the first historical kings, men like Gilgamesh, whose name we know not only from the King List but from other archaeological records. Gilgamesh's reign, recorded at a more reasonable 126 years, marks a significant shift. It suggests that the mythological world of the gods has now collided with the human world. Before we move forward, remember to hit that like button and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're about to dive deeper into how the King List connects to the greater story of humanity's ancient past. But first, let's pause and consider the implications of the King List's timeline. The long reigns, those seemingly impossible lengths of time, are a tantalizing clue. Were these kings truly human? Or were they demigods, rulers who walked the earth with divine authority? Some scholars believe that these ancient Sumerian rulers were not ordinary men, but powerful beings who could transcend the limitations of human life. Their reigns exaggerated to emphasize their importance, but there's another interpretation. What if the Sumerians weren't exaggerating at all? What if these kings were indeed divine, as they claimed? This brings us to the question of the gods. The Sumerians believed that their rulers were chosen by deities to lead them. But the nature of these gods was not what we might expect. They were not ethereal beings of light and love. They were real, tangible, and often capricious figures who had their own agendas. They were gods who did not sit idly by, watching humanity struggle below. They were involved in every aspect of life, guiding, punishing, and sometimes even creating humanity itself. The Sumerian gods were not abstract beings, they were very much a part of the human world. In the beginning, the king list speaks of rulers like Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, was not just a ruler, he was a god in human form. Eridu, according to Sumerian mythology, was the first city ever established. The city, founded by the gods themselves, was said to be a place of unimaginable power, where the divine and the mortal world intersected. The gods themselves are said to have walked the streets of Eridu, watching over their human creations. The king list doesn't just mention these rulers, it elevates them. It paints them as divine figures, chosen by the gods to maintain cosmic order. It suggests that the earliest kings weren't ordinary humans at all. They were beings with extraordinary lifespans, with powers beyond the reach of mortals. But as time went on, this divine connection seemed to diminish, and human rulers began to take on more familiar, shorter lifespans. But what caused this shift? Why did the gods begin to withdraw their influence? The answer may lie in the flood. This event, recorded in nearly every ancient civilization, from the Mesopotamian accounts to the biblical story of Noah, is often seen as a turning point in human history. According to the Sumerian king list, after the flood, the reigns of kings began to fall more in line with the human experience. The reigns became more realistic, and the divine rulers were replaced by mortal kings. This transition from divine kings to human rulers is not just a matter of mythological storytelling. It is a reflection of a broader change in how humans understood their relationship with the gods. Before the flood, humanity was governed by divine beings who ruled with absolute authority. But after the flood, this divine connection seems to have been severed. The gods, it appears, retreated from the world, leaving behind a legacy of powerful kings who were now mere mortals. The flood itself is one of the most enduring symbols in the king list. It marks the point where the divine and mortal worlds collide. The flood, according to the Sumerian tradition, was a punishment from the gods, a cataclysmic event that wiped out much of humanity. In the aftermath, the gods seem to retreat, and humanity is left to fend for itself. The gods no longer walk among us, and the kingship is no longer divine. Instead, it becomes a mortal institution, grounded in the realities of life and death. As we move forward, we need to ask ourselves, what did the Sumerians truly believe about their kings? Were these rulers mere mortals, or were they part of a divine bloodline, chosen to rule by the gods themselves? To answer this question, we must look at the broader context of Sumerian religion and mythology. In Sumerian mythology, the gods were not distant beings. They were involved in every aspect of human life, and they were often depicted as interacting with humans directly. The gods were not just passive observers. They were active participants in the world. They created humanity, they guided the kings, and they punished those who defied them. Take, for example, the story of Enki and Enlil. These two gods are central to Sumerian mythology. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, is often depicted as a benevolent figure who helps humanity. Enlil, on the other hand, is portrayed as a stern and often harsh god who governs the earth. These two gods, along with the other members of the Anunnaki pantheon, were seen as the ruling forces in the cosmos. They were the ones who decided the fate of humanity, and they were the ones who chose the kings. But as the king list suggests, the gods eventually retreated from the world. After the flood, the reigns of kings became shorter, and the divine influence waned. The gods, it seems, no longer played an active role in human affairs. Instead, humanity was left to rule itself, with the kings of Sumer serving as the earthly representatives of the gods. This shift from divine rule to mortal rule is one of the most fascinating aspects of the king list. It suggests that at one point, humanity was governed by divine beings, and that these beings were responsible for the rise of civilization itself. But as time went on, the gods withdrew, leaving behind a legacy of rulers who were once considered gods themselves. Before we move on, let's reflect on the broader implications of the Sumerian king list. It's easy to dismiss this text as a simple record of kings, but when we look at it in the context of Sumerian religion and mythology, it becomes clear that it holds deeper meaning. The king list is not just a list of rulers, it's a record of the divine bloodlines that were believed to have shaped human civilization. As we continue our journey through the Sumerian king list, we encounter a world where the boundaries between myth and reality blur. The kings who once ruled as gods were no longer divine after the flood, but that doesn't mean their divine nature vanished entirely. No, the connection between the kings and the gods lingered. It was just a different kind of relationship, a more human one, where the gods were no longer as active in the day-to-day lives of men, but their influence still cast a long shadow over the rulers who came after. Consider the city of Uruk, the kingdom of Gilgamesh, the legendary figure who haunts the pages of both the king list and the epic that bears his name. Gilgamesh, who reigned for 126 years, was a king with an extraordinary lineage. He was 2/3 divine, and yet he still walked among men, bound by the same mortality that plagued humanity. And in his story, we can see the echoes of this shift, from the divine rule of gods to the reign of mortal kings. Gilgamesh's story is not just that of a mighty ruler, it's the story of a man caught between two worlds, one divine and one mortal. In his journey to seek immortality, Gilgamesh faces the reality of his own limitations. This quest brings him face to face with the gods who created him, forcing him to confront the very nature of his existence. But more than that, it reveals the deep yearning of humanity to transcend death, to overcome the limitations of our human condition. The gods, once active and involved, had withdrawn after the Great Flood, the flood that had wiped away much of humanity and left a dark scar on civilization, one that could never be erased. After the flood, the gods seemingly retreated to their celestial abodes, leaving humanity to rebuild itself. This new world, one where the divine presence was no longer as palpable, gave rise to the need for a new kind of kingship, one that, while still connected to the gods, was more grounded in human experience. The kings that followed, from Gilgamesh onward, may have been divinely chosen, but they were now more human than divine. The question that lingers, however, is whether this shift was a natural evolution or something forced upon the Sumerians. Was the divine withdrawal a consequence of humanity's own actions, or was it the result of cosmic forces beyond their comprehension? The flood, often interpreted as a punishment from the gods, marks the great divide between the age of the gods and the age of men. But it also serves as a symbol of renewal, a reminder that even the gods could not escape the forces of time and nature. The divine order that had once reigned supreme was shaken to its core, and with it, the kingship of the Sumerians was forever altered. As the centuries passed, the Sumerian king list grew increasingly human in its portrayal of rulers. After the divine reigns came to an end, the lifespans of kings began to shorten dramatically. The mythic, timeless world of the gods gave way to the reality of mortal kings, whose reigns were defined by the limitations of time and power. But despite this shift, the influence of the gods still loomed large in the background. The kings of Sumer may have been human, but they were never truly divorced from their divine origins. It's this tension between divinity and humanity that makes the king list so intriguing. While the gods no longer directly controlled the fate of humanity, their legacy was still very much alive. The king list, with its mythic overtones and divine connections, serves as a reminder that the ancient Sumerians never fully severed their ties to the divine. The gods, in their own way, continued to shape the course of human history, even as their presence faded into the background. So what can we take away from this ancient text? What does it tell us about the Sumerians' understanding of their world and their place in it? The King List offers us a window into a time when the line between the divine and the mortal was not as clear as it is today. The Sumerians didn't see their kings as mere political leaders. They saw them as divine instruments, chosen by the gods to guide humanity. But even as the gods withdrew from the world, their influence remained. The King List is not just a historical document, it is a reflection of the Sumerians' worldview, one where the divine and the human were intricately intertwined. Before we dive deeper into the significance of these divine kings, let's pause and reflect on something important. If the gods ruled before humans, as the King List suggests, then what does that tell us about the origins of civilization? Were the Sumerians simply building upon the knowledge handed down by divine rulers? Or were they rediscovering lost technologies and wisdom from an ancient, forgotten age? This is a question that continues to haunt scholars, and it's one we will explore further as we move through the King List. Let's take a closer look at the city of Eridu, the first city mentioned in the King List. Eridu was said to have been founded by the gods themselves, with its first ruler, Alulim, reigning for a staggering 28,800 years. This city, located in the southern part of modern-day Iraq, is considered the cradle of Sumerian civilization. But more than that, it's seen as a place where the divine and the mortal worlds intersected. The gods, according to Sumerian tradition, didn't just create Eridu, they inhabited it. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the civilization that would follow. The divine kings who ruled over Eridu and other early Sumerian cities were not just political leaders, they were representatives of the gods on earth. The King List, with its exaggerated reigns and divine connections, reflects this belief. These kings were not merely human rulers, they were vessels for the gods, their power and authority emanating directly from the divine realm. But as the King List progresses, the kingship becomes more human. The reigns of the kings begin to shrink and the divine bloodlines become less pronounced. By the time we reach Gilgamesh, the king who would become the subject of one of the world's greatest epics, we see a ruler who is both human and divine, a king whose story bridges the gap between the gods and men. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is a reflection of humanity's struggle to transcend its limitations, to reach beyond the mortal coil and grasp the eternal. It is a story that speaks to the deepest fears and desires of the human soul, the desire to overcome death, to live forever, and to stand beside the gods. And yet Gilgamesh's journey ends in failure. He does not achieve immortality, and in the end he returns to Uruk, where he can only admire the walls he built as his legacy. This perhaps is the most poignant part of his story. The walls of Uruk, the great city he created, stand as a monument to his power and influence. They are a testament to his legacy as a king. But in the end, it is not the gods or immortality that Gilgamesh leaves behind. It is the city itself, a lasting reminder of his reign. As we continue to unravel the mystery of the Sumerian King List, we step deeper into the very fabric of early Mesopotamian civilization, where the divine and mortal realms were not separate, but intimately connected. The gods and their chosen rulers were inseparable. They shaped and defined each other's existence. It's impossible to understand the political or religious dynamics of ancient Sumer without recognizing the central role that these divine kings played in the culture, both as symbolic and literal representations of the gods on earth. The shift in the King List, from the divine reigns of pre-flood rulers to the more human-like kings that followed, signifies a profound transformation in the relationship between humanity and the gods. But what did this change mean for the people who lived during this time? How did they perceive the gods, and what role did the kings play in keeping their divine influence alive? The answers to these questions lie in the way the Sumerians intertwined their royal history with their mythology and religion. One of the most significant aspects of Sumerian religion is the concept of the Anunnaki, the pantheon of gods who were believed to have created humanity and governed every aspect of the cosmos. The Anunnaki were not just distant ethereal beings, they were active participants in the world, shaping the fates of kings, cities, and individuals alike. And the kings of Sumer, as we've seen in the king list, were not just men. They were divine agents of these gods, chosen to rule and maintain the balance of the world. In this context, the king list is much more than a chronological record of rulers. It is a religious text, one that ties the earthly kings to a divine lineage. From Alulim's reign of 28,800 years in Eridu to the more historically grounded reign of Gilgamesh in Uruk, the list functions as a bridge between the mythic past and the more structured present. But it also serves as a reminder that, in the Sumerian worldview, no ruler was truly human. Every king was the vessel through which the gods ruled over the earth. As we move forward, we must consider the broader mythological significance of the kings and their connection to the divine. While the king list is an essential historical document, it is also steeped in symbolism that reflects the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos. The very concept of kingship in Sumer was inextricably linked to the divine order. Kings did not rule by mere human authority. Their power came from the gods, and their reigns were seen as part of a larger cosmic drama in which the divine will was made manifest through earthly rulers. Take, for example, the story of Enlil, the god of air, earth, and storms. Enlil played a pivotal role in Sumerian mythology and was one of the most influential gods in the pantheon. In the king list, Enlil's influence is reflected in the reigns of kings who were believed to have been chosen by him to lead. But Enlil was not just a god of benevolence. His wrath could be equally destructive. It was Enlil who, according to the Sumerian accounts, ordered the flood that wiped out much of humanity, an event that changed the course of history as recorded in the king list. This flood marks the point at which the divine reign of kings begins to shift toward more human rulers, who, while still considered divine, are no longer seen as immortal beings. The flood, however, is not just a tale of destruction. It also represents the idea of renewal and transformation. It is as though the gods themselves, through Enlil's decision, were signaling a change in the order of things. The flood, then, can be seen as both a punishment and a cleansing. The old world, governed by divine kings who were part God themselves, is washed away. In its place, humanity begins to rebuild, not under the absolute authority of the gods, but in a world where divine favor is still important, but less direct and overwhelming. What follows is a shift in the understanding of kingship. No longer are rulers considered to be gods in human form, as the first kings of the king list are described. Instead, they are mortal men chosen by the gods, and while their bloodline may be divinely chosen, they no longer possess the immortality or divine status of their predecessors. This is evident in the dramatic reduction in the length of the king's reigns after the flood. Kings like Gilgamesh, whose reign of 126 years is far more reasonable than the tens of thousands of years granted to earlier rulers, represent a more human-centered society, a society that still looks to the gods for guidance, but one that is more independent in its political and social development. It's essential to recognize that the decline in the length of reigns does not necessarily mean the gods withdrew entirely. On the contrary, the gods were still central to the Sumerian worldview. Their influence, however, became more symbolic. The kings who followed the divine kings were still believed to be under the gods' protection and favor, but their rule was now grounded in reality. The connection between the divine and the mortal had not disappeared. It had simply transformed. The gods no longer walked among the people, but their influence was still felt in the governance of the land. The divine kingship was still revered, but it was now seen through a more human lens. It's fascinating to think about what this transition means for the Sumerians themselves. How did they reconcile the idea of divine kingship with the more human-focused reality that followed the flood? The king list provides us with a glimpse into this process. As the reigns of kings become more grounded in the human experience, the Sumerians may have seen their kings as intermediaries between the gods and the people, rather than as gods themselves. The kings were still chosen by the gods, but they were no longer immortal rulers. Instead, they were mortal men, entrusted with the responsibility of ruling in the gods' stead. As we explore the significance of the king list, we must ask, what does it reveal about the Sumerians' understanding of their own place in the world? The king list speaks to a people who saw their rulers as divine instruments, chosen by the gods to maintain cosmic order. But it also speaks to a people who were beginning to come to terms with their own mortality. The gods, once active and involved in the affairs of humanity, had retreated. And with that retreat came a realization. The reign of the divine kings was over. The world was now in the hands of mortals. This idea of the divine kingship transitioning into mortal rule can be seen as a reflection of a broader cultural shift. The Sumerians, like all civilizations, faced the inevitability of change. Their gods, once so central to their lives, were now less present in the daily affairs of men. But the memory of the divine kings still lived on, and the king list serves as a testament to that legacy. It is a record of a time when the divine and mortal worlds were intertwined, and it provides us with insight into the way the Sumerians saw themselves, caught between the heavens and the earth, between gods and men. As we continue to delve deeper into the implications of the king list, we must consider how this ancient text fits into the broader tapestry of human history. The Sumerians were not the only culture to develop stories of divine kings. Across the ancient world, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, stories of god kings and divine rulers were central to the development of early civilizations. These stories, as recorded in texts like the King List, shaped the way people saw their rulers and their relationship to the divine. And while the details of these stories vary, the underlying themes are strikingly similar. The divine kings of Sumer, like those of Egypt, were seen as the earthly representatives of the gods. Their reigns were viewed as the will of the gods made manifest on earth. And like the Egyptian pharaohs, the Sumerian kings were believed to be divinely appointed, chosen to rule and to maintain order in the world. But as we've seen in the king list, this connection between the gods and their rulers begins to fade over time. The gods may have created humanity and guided its early rulers, but eventually humanity was left to rule itself. As we continue to probe the mysteries embedded in the Sumerian king list, we find ourselves at the crossroads of history and myth. The very structure of the king list suggests something monumental occurred after the flood, a shift that not only affected the political landscape of Sumer, but also the very way its people understood the divine and their place within the cosmos. The gods, once active participants in the governance of the world, receded from the earthly realm, leaving behind a legacy that would echo throughout history. What we see in the king list is not merely a record of kings and their reigns. We see a transformation in the way humanity viewed itself. It's a powerful reminder that ancient societies were not static. They evolved. And these changes were not just social or political. They were spiritual, philosophical, and deeply rooted in a culture's understanding of the cosmos. The divine kingship that once seemed eternal and unshakable was, over time, replaced with a new model of governance. After the flood, we see the reigns of kings shrink from the astronomical to the plausible. The king list reflects a world in transition, where the gods' active involvement in the fate of humankind gave way to more human-centered leadership. But this shift did not mean the gods disappeared from the Sumerian worldview. Instead, it marked a change in how the Sumerians perceived their relationship to the divine. The gods became more distant, more symbolic, but their influence was still felt in the very fabric of their kingship. Before diving deeper into the broader cultural implications, it's important to consider what the transition from divine kings to mortal rulers meant for the people of Sumer. If the gods were no longer directly intervening in the affairs of men, how did the Sumerians maintain a sense of divine order? How did the kings, now mortal, continue to justify their rule as divinely sanctioned? The answer, in part, lies in the ritual and symbolic elements of kingship. In ancient Sumer, the king was not merely a political leader, he was a representative of the divine on earth. Even after the gods' active presence in human affairs diminished, the king was still seen as divinely chosen. This was not simply a ceremonial title, it was the very foundation of the king's authority. The Sumerian king was often referred to as the servant of the gods or the shepherd of the people. His role was not just to govern but to maintain cosmic order, and to ensure that the will of the gods was carried out. This belief in the divine sanction of kingship was not unique to Sumer. It echoed through the civilizations of the ancient world. From Egypt to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, the concept of divine kingship was foundational to early governance. The pharaohs of Egypt, for example, were considered gods on earth, divine rulers whose authority was unquestionable. Similarly, the kings of Babylon, like those of Sumer, were seen as the earthly representatives of the gods. They were granted their authority through divine favor, a belief that provided not only political legitimacy, but spiritual significance as well. But the shift in Sumer, as reflected in the king list, marked the end of an era. The divine kings, whose reigns spanned millennia, were replaced by mortal rulers who, while still believed to be divinely chosen, no longer possessed the immortality or superhuman qualities of their predecessors. The transition was gradual but unmistakable, and it reflected a growing awareness among the Sumerians that their world was governed not just by divine power, but by human agency as well. It is crucial to recognize the cultural significance of this shift. The Sumerians, like many ancient civilizations, were deeply concerned with the maintenance of cosmic order. This was not just a matter of political governance, but of spiritual survival. The kings, as intermediaries between the gods and the people, were responsible for ensuring that the will of the gods was manifested in the world. They were expected to maintain harmony in the land, ensuring that the gods were appeased and that prosperity flowed from the heavens down to the people. However, as the reigns of the kings became shorter and more human-centered, the Sumerians faced a new challenge: how to maintain this cosmic order without the direct intervention of the gods. The gods, once so tangible and active, were now distant. Their direct influence was gone, but the need for divine favor remained. The answer came in the form of rituals, sacrifices, and prayers. The king, though mortal, continued to serve as the conduit through which the divine order was enacted. The priesthood, which had always played a crucial role in Sumerian society, became even more important in the aftermath of the flood. The gods were no longer physically present, but they were still believed to reside in the rituals and offerings made to them. This shift from divine kingship to mortal rule also had significant implications for the way the Sumerians understood their own history. If the kings were once divine, then the history of Sumer was inextricably tied to the divine realm. The king list, in this sense, was more than just a political record. It was a religious document, a testament to the divine origins of the Sumerian people. The kings of Sumer were not just men. They were gods in human form, and their reigns were the manifestation of divine will. But as the divine kingship faded, so too did the direct connection between the kings and the gods. The history of Sumer, as told through the king list, became less about the divine and more about the human. The shift from divine kings to mortal rulers marked a profound change in the way the Sumerians viewed their world. The gods, once so tangible and involved in every aspect of life, were now more distant, their presence relegated to the rituals and symbols of kingship. The kings, while still divinely chosen, were no longer seen as gods themselves. This shift also had significant implications for the way the Sumerians understood the passage of time. The king list begins with rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, an impossibly long time, even by the standards of ancient kings. These long reigns were not meant to be taken literally, but rather symbolized the divine nature of the rulers. They were immortal, eternal beings whose reigns spanned the ages. But as the king list progresses, the reigns of the kings become shorter, more realistic. This is not just a reflection of the changing nature of kingship, but also a reflection of the changing perception of time itself. Before the flood, time was malleable, shaped by the will of the gods. The long reigns of the early kings were a reflection of the gods' eternal power and influence. But after the flood, time became more linear and human-centered. The gods, no longer active participants in the world, could no longer stretch time to suit their purposes. The reigns of the kings, now grounded in human reality, reflected the limits of mortal life. It is this shift in the perception of time that makes the Sumerian king list such a fascinating document. It offers us a glimpse into a world where the divine and the mortal were once inseparable, where kings were gods in human form. But it also shows us the moment when this divine connection began to fade and humanity was left to grapple with the reality of time and mortality. As we consider the implications of the king list, we must also ask, what did the Sumerians believe about their own origins? The king list, with its divine kings and its mythological structure, suggests that the Sumerians saw themselves as part of a larger cosmic order. Their kings were not just political rulers. They were divine agents of the gods, chosen to maintain balance and order in the world. But the flood, and the subsequent transition from divine to mortal kingship, marks a turning point in this worldview. The Sumerians were no longer just the children of the gods. They were now a people left to govern themselves, relying on the gods only for guidance. This shift in the Sumerian worldview is profound. It marks the end of an era where the divine was present and active in every aspect of life, and the beginning of a new era where humanity was left to navigate its own path. The king list, in this sense, is not just a historical document. It is a record of the evolution of human consciousness. It shows us a society in transition, moving from a world where the gods were tangible and immediate to one where humanity must rely on its own strength and wisdom to survive. But even as the gods receded into the background, they did not disappear entirely. Their influence was still felt in the rituals, the kingship, and the mythology that shaped Sumerian society. The gods may have retreated, but their legacy lived on through the kings they had once chosen to rule. As the reign of divine kings began to fade, the Sumerians still clung to the remnants of that ancient connection. The idea of kingship, once rooted in the gods themselves, began to evolve, but the echoes of divine authority were never entirely erased. Instead, they took on new forms, shifting from one civilization to the next, adapted by each culture that inherited this framework of rulership. In Sumer, the role of the king continued to be that of a servant of the gods, even after the long reigns and divine lifespans became a thing of legend. The gods were no longer directly intervening in the lives of men, but their will was still seen as the foundation for kingship. The king, though mortal, was still viewed as the chosen one, a man tasked with carrying out the god's will. This understanding persisted in the rituals and ceremonies that were central to governance. The king did not act alone, but with the guidance of priests who interpreted the divine will through the stars, the heavens, and the earth. These rituals were essential for maintaining cosmic balance, and the king's role was never purely political. He was, in essence, the intermediary between the gods and the people. This intermediary role extended beyond just the Sumerians, spreading to later civilizations like the Babylonians and Assyrians, where kings were still viewed as divinely ordained figures. However, as time passed, these kings began to rely more on their military might and political strategies, as well as their ability to craft laws to solidify their power. This shift marks a transition from rulers who were simply vehicles of divine will to those who exercised power as part of a more human-centered worldview. Yet even as kingship took on a more mortal form, the concept of divine kingship never fully disappeared. It persisted in subtle ways. In Babylon, for instance, Hammurabi's code of laws was presented as a divine mandate from the gods themselves, handed down to him by the god Shamash, the sun god of justice. This divine endorsement of lawmaking was meant to ensure that the king's decrees were seen as legitimate, grounded in divine wisdom. Hammurabi, while undoubtedly a powerful ruler in his own right, used the symbolic link to the divine to bolster his authority, framing his rule as a continuation of the divine kingship that had once been a direct and palpable force in human affairs. In Egypt, divine kingship took on a slightly different form. Pharaohs were regarded as living gods, but even they had to navigate a world where their divine authority was increasingly contested by the practical realities of governance. While they were still seen as the direct representation of the gods on earth, over time their role shifted from one of active divine intervention to one of divine authorization. The gods did not directly walk among the people, but their presence was still channeled through the pharaoh, who governed by the will of the gods. This structure laid the foundation for a deeply ritualistic and theocratic society, where the king's authority was inseparable from the religious practices that permeated every aspect of daily life. But it was not just in Mesopotamia or Egypt that the idea of divine kingship left its mark. In Mesoamerica, for example, the rulers of the Maya civilization also carried the divine mantle. They were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, chosen to perform the rituals that would ensure the prosperity and stability of their society. The Maya kings, much like the Sumerian rulers before them, performed elaborate ceremonies, including bloodletting rituals, to maintain divine favor and ensure the continued balance of the cosmos. These rituals, though seemingly archaic to modern sensibilities, were essential to the survival of these ancient societies. They were a continuation of the belief that the king's role was not just to rule, but to sustain the connection between the heavens and the earth. The significance of divine kingship persisted far beyond the ancient world. As empires grew and societies expanded, the idea of the king as the chosen one, the divine ruler, evolved. By the time we reach ancient Rome, we see the emergence of the imperial cult. The Roman emperor, while not a god in the traditional sense, was still viewed as divinely chosen, often deified after death, and sometimes during their lifetime. Roman emperors such as Augustus were not only political figures, but also seen as the link between the people and the gods. The emperor's role was both political and spiritual, tasked with maintaining order in the empire and ensuring that the gods favored Rome. Even in medieval Europe, the echoes of divine kingship remained. The concept of the divine right of kings emerged in the Middle Ages, when monarchs claimed that their authority came directly from God. Kings and queens were seen as God's appointed rulers on earth, their power sacred and untouchable. While the political systems had changed drastically from the time of the Sumerians, the core idea that rulers were divinely chosen remained intact. This belief reinforced the monarchy's legitimacy and power, providing rulers with the spiritual backing they needed to maintain their authority. As we reflect on the history of kingship, we see how the idea of divine rulers has evolved across different cultures and civilizations. The Sumerian king list, with its record of divine kings and their long reigns, represents a time when the line between the mortal and the divine was thin. Kings were seen as gods on earth, chosen to rule with the power of the divine behind them. But over time, this idea shifted. Kings no longer ruled by divine decree alone. Their power became more human, grounded in political and military strength, in their ability to control territory, and in their ability to forge laws that could bring order to their people. The transition from divine kingship to mortal rulers is not a simple story of loss. It is a story of evolution. The Sumerians may have seen their kings as divine, but as their world changed, so did their understanding of kingship. The kingship of Sumer was not abolished, it was transformed. The king became more human, more fallible, but still carrying the weight of divine expectation. This evolution laid the foundation for the concept of the king as a servant of the gods, as seen in later cultures such as Babylon, Egypt, and beyond. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is how these shifts in kingship reflect broader changes in the way humanity saw itself. The gods may have once walked among men, but as time passed, humanity began to realize that it was capable of governing itself. The Sumerian king list, though it records the reigns of divine kings, also foreshadows the rise of human agency. The gods, though still revered, were no longer the sole force shaping human destiny. Humanity, with its kings and rulers, would now take its place as the architects of its own future. The Sumerians, in their shift from divine kings to mortal rulers, were not rejecting the divine, they were evolving with it. The transition marks the beginning of a new era, one where humanity was no longer subjugated by divine will, but empowered to shape its own fate. It's a story that speaks not just to the past, but to the future, a future where humanity, while still looking to the divine for guidance, would take the reins of its own destiny. And so the divine kings of Sumer may have been replaced by mortal rulers, but their legacy lived on. The echoes of their divine rule resonated through the ages, shaping the civilizations that followed. The Sumerian king list, in all its glory, provides us with a glimpse into the past. A past where gods and kings walked hand in hand, and where humanity's journey to self-determination was just beginning. As the divine kingship receded into history, the Sumerians, like all ancient civilizations, were forced to reimagine their understanding of power. While earlier kings were regarded as gods themselves, or at least as divine manifestations on earth, their successors began to take a more human form, their reigns grounded in more earthly concerns. Yet this shift didn't strip away the reverence for the gods. It simply changed how the gods were viewed in relation to humanity's progression. The king list offers us a profound understanding of how the transition from divine kings to mortal rulers mirrored shifts in human consciousness. For the Sumerians, their kings were the vital link between the human and divine realms, a bridge that allowed the heavens to guide earthly affairs. The gods' withdrawal didn't signal a total loss of divine influence, but rather a subtle redefinition of how that influence worked. As Sumer transitioned from the reigns of gods to the rule of mortal kings, society didn't simply let go of its divine connection. It adapted. Kings were still seen as divinely chosen, but now their roles became more humanized. They were no longer perceived as gods on earth, but they carried the divine mandate, ensuring they remained connected to the gods through rituals, temples, and offerings. This allowed them to still justify their authority with divine approval, without claiming to embody the gods themselves. This evolution reflected the broader societal changes in Sumer. It was no longer enough to be divinely chosen. A king had to prove his worth through governance, lawmaking, and military prowess. They needed to show they could protect their people, lead their armies, and establish the infrastructure necessary for society to thrive. The gods, though still honored and revered, took a more symbolic role in governance. No longer did the gods directly intervene in the daily affairs of men. They remained a distant guiding force, and the king was now the one expected to maintain order. This shift wasn't unique to Sumer, though. Other ancient cultures saw similar evolutions in kingship. In ancient Egypt, for example, the pharaoh was still considered divine, a living god who embodied Horus on earth. But even in Egypt, over time, the notion of the divine king became more complex. The pharaohs, while still regarded as divine, faced increasing pressures to prove their worth through administrative, military, and political acumen. Their divine status became entwined with the health of the state and the prosperity of the people. The pharaohs may have been gods on earth, but they were gods with responsibilities. The gods may have been believed to walk among them, but in the end, it was the pharaoh's rule, his ability to ensure the land's welfare, that truly defined his reign. The Sumerian kings, after the flood, faced a similar balancing act. They were still divinely chosen, but their divine mandate was now filtered through the practical aspects of governance. Kings like Gilgamesh, for example, were revered not just because they were divinely appointed, but also because they were seen as rulers who understood the needs of their people, who built cities, who established order, and who crafted the very laws by which their people lived. Yet the underlying truth remained. The king, even in his mortal form, was still seen as a reflection of the divine order. His actions, decisions, and even his survival were considered to be the will of the gods. The king list reminds us that despite the shift to more human kingship, the line between the divine and the mortal never fully disappeared. The king was still the conduit through which divine favor was mediated. He was the man through whom the gods' will could still manifest on earth. This idea persisted long after Sumer fell, echoing in later empires and civilizations. One of the most significant aspects of this transition is how it reflects humanity's understanding of its own power and potential. The Sumerians, once ruled directly by gods, were gradually being taught to rule themselves. The shift from divine kingship to mortal kingship is a symbolic turning point. It marks the moment when humans, once seen as subjects of the gods, began to see themselves as participants in the grand drama of existence, capable of shaping their own destiny. This transformation is not just political, it's deeply philosophical. The gods, once so deeply involved in the affairs of men, retreat. They still exist, but they are no longer the omnipresent force they once were. Humanity must now take responsibility for its own fate. In a sense, the retreat of the gods symbolizes the coming of age of human society. As the gods step back, humanity steps forward, with the kings acting as intermediaries, but no longer as gods themselves. The power once exclusively held by the divine is now shared with the kings, the rulers, the men and women who would define the future of their civilizations. Yet even as humans began to rule themselves, the connection to the divine did not vanish. The relationship between gods and kings became more symbolic and ritualistic, rather than direct and physical. The kings of Sumer, like their successors in Egypt, Babylon and beyond, continued to perform rituals to maintain divine favor. These rituals served as a constant reminder of the gods' importance, and they reinforced the king's role as the intermediary between heaven and earth. For example, in Sumer, the king would offer sacrifices to the gods, build grand temples, and perform religious rites to ensure that the gods were appeased and that their favor remained with the people. In return, the people were expected to honor the king as the divine representative on earth. The ritualized connection between the gods, the kings, and the people remained a cornerstone of Sumerian society. This transition from direct divine rule to a more humanized kingship set the stage for later empires. As we look at the rise of the Babylonian Empire, we see similar themes emerge. King Hammurabi, like the earlier kings of Sumer, was seen as divinely chosen. But his reign also marked a shift from the divine kingship of Sumer to a more human-centered governance. where laws became the foundation of authority. Hammurabi's famous Code of Laws was not just a collection of legal decrees, it was a divine mandate. It was presented as a set of laws given to him by the god Shamash, the sun god of justice. However, it also reflects the increasing importance of human reason and governance, grounded in the realities of maintaining order in a growing empire. The legacy of Sumerian kingship continued to influence these later civilizations. Even as the idea of the divine king evolved, the notion that kings were chosen by the gods, or at the very least, were divinely sanctioned, remained a central theme. In Rome, for example, the emperor was not a god, but was seen as the representative of divine will on earth. This idea of the king or emperor as a representative of divine authority is a direct continuation of the Sumerian concept of kingship, albeit with significant modifications. By the time we reach the Roman Empire, divine kingship had become more ceremonial, but it was still an integral part of political authority. Throughout these civilizations, the king's authority was often bolstered by religion and ritual. The king was still considered the bridge between the divine and mortal worlds, even as the direct intervention of the gods became less tangible. The gods' influence on governance continued to be felt through the religious rituals performed by kings, the divine right to rule, and the connection between political power and spiritual legitimacy. The divine kingship of Sumer may have waned, but its essence lived on in the ceremonial roles of rulers across cultures and centuries. As the gods receded into the background, humanity's understanding of its own potential expanded. The shift from divine kings to mortal rulers was not a loss. It was an evolution. Humans, once mere subjects of divine will, had begun to take charge of their own destiny. The kings of Sumer, though still connected to the divine, were no longer purely divine themselves. They were now the stewards of the people, responsible for governance, law, and order. They were men, yet their reigns were still seen as the will of the gods, and their legacies were shaped by both human action and divine favor. As we continue down the path of understanding how the divine kingship of Sumer left an indelible mark on the structure of future civilizations, we see that the transition from gods ruling through kings to human kings ruling with divine authority was not a simple linear progression. The impact of this shift on human governance, religious practice, and cultural identity is profound, far-reaching, and complex. The Sumerians, through the king list, crafted a legacy that would resonate through the corridors of history. They provided not just a record of rulers, but an ideology, an understanding of kingship as both a human and divine construct. The king list's notion that kings were divinely chosen, even if no longer divine themselves, set a precedent that influenced how humanity perceived power and authority. This idea would spread across the ancient world, shaping the governance of not just Mesopotamia, but Egypt, Persia, and even later, the Roman Empire. But the impact of divine kingship wasn't confined to these ancient empires. It echoed in the political systems of the Middle Ages and beyond. As monarchies rose in Europe, the idea of kingship tied to divine favor became central to the political legitimacy of rulers. The divine right of kings, a doctrine that argued kings were appointed by God and thus beyond reproach, directly traces its roots to the belief systems first articulated in the Sumerian king list. While medieval kings did not claim to be gods themselves, they inherited the same logic of divine authority. Rulers were divinely chosen to maintain order and enforce the will of the gods on earth. In the Sumerian view, the king's role was not just political, it was sacred. This sacredness was woven into every aspect of Sumerian culture. The king, whether ruling with the gods' direct intervention or by divine mandate, was expected to maintain cosmic order, or a set of divine laws that governed both the heavens and the earth. These laws weren't abstract ideals. They were practical guidelines that governed everything from how people should treat one another to the way society should be structured. Maintaining me was the king's sacred duty, and failure to do so invited the wrath of the gods, as seen in the mythological accounts of kings punished for failing their divine mandates. What sets the king list apart is its reflection of the intersection between mythology, governance, and societal survival. The Sumerians did not view their kings as mere political leaders. They viewed them as living embodiments of divine will, a function of the gods that ensured balance and order. Even as this direct divine kingship faded, the role of the king remained deeply entwined with the sacred. The king was still the axis around which the divine order revolved, even if the gods no longer directly intervened in earthly matters. In understanding the consequences of this shift, we must also ask, what happened to the people when the gods no longer actively walked the earth? When kings were no longer immortals, when their reigns were not measured in thousands of years, what did this mean for Sumerian society? For a culture that had once believed that the divine directly shaped every aspect of their lives, this shift must have felt like an existential loss. But it also sparked something new, a need for human agency. As divine kingship receded into the background, the Sumerians were forced to reckon with their own role in shaping their fate. It was no longer enough to passively rely on the gods to intervene. Humanity, for better or worse, had to take responsibility for itself. This shift, seen in the king list's documentation of kings with mortal reigns, marks the beginning of a new era in human civilization, one where humanity itself must govern, lead, and create. And this idea wasn't confined to the Sumerians. In the wake of divine kingship's decline, civilizations across the world would be forced to reckon with their relationship to the divine. This evolution of kingship, moving from direct divine rule to human-centered governance, spread through the Fertile Crescent to Egypt, Persia, and eventually to Rome. But even within these powerful empires, echoes of the original Sumerian idea, kings as chosen by the gods, remained. In ancient Egypt, for example, the pharaoh was believed to be a living god, the son of Ra, the sun god, whose divine authority was reinforced through rituals, monumental architecture, and an extensive bureaucracy. But even the pharaohs, despite their divine status, had to balance their governance with the needs of their people. While divine sanction remained a crucial element of their reigns, their ability to rule effectively depended on their military strength, their control over resources, and their skill in maintaining the societal structures that held Egypt together. Similarly, in Persia, the idea of a divinely appointed ruler was crucial to the legitimacy of the kings of the Achaemenid Empire. Kings like Cyrus the Great were seen as the anointed rulers of God, divinely chosen to lead and maintain order across the vast expanse of their empire. The religious backing of kingship in Persia carried the same weight as in Sumer. It wasn't just the king's will that mattered, but the will of the divine, which was reflected through the monarch. By the time the Roman Empire rose to prominence, the divine status of emperors became deeply enmeshed in the fabric of Roman governance. Though emperors were not gods in the traditional sense, their reign was often legitimized through claims of divine favor. Emperors like Augustus, the first Roman emperor, promoted himself as Divi Filius, son of a god, highlighting his divine connection to the gods. Even when Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, the idea of divine kingship remained central to the emperor's authority. The Roman emperor's role as a Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest in Roman religion, cemented his role as the divine intermediary between the gods and the people, further linking the emperor to the divine will. The legacy of divine kingship was not just political or cultural, it was spiritual. The idea that rulers were not simply human, but divine or divinely chosen provided the spiritual justification for authority. This idea persisted long after the fall of Sumer, evolving to fit the needs and structures of new empires. It spoke to humanity's inherent desire for order, for a connection to the divine, and for the reassurance that their rulers were not just products of earthly politics, but of a greater cosmic plan. As we step into the more modern world, the remnants of this ancient system still echo through the structures of power, leadership, and spirituality. Monarchies, even in contemporary times, are often still seen as divinely ordained, a vestige of the ancient belief that kings ruled by divine right. Though these monarchs may no longer rule with the same absolute power as their Sumerian or Egyptian predecessors, the symbolism of divine kingship remains entrenched in the cultural psyche. The idea that a ruler is chosen by a higher power is deeply embedded in the political consciousness of societies worldwide. The divine right of kings may no longer hold the same sway it once did, but the fundamental need for a connection between the political and the divine is still present. Whether through the ceremonial functions of modern monarchs, the use of religious symbols in political life, or the reliance on spiritual ideologies to guide governance, the ancient understanding of kingship as a divine institution endures. Even in our secular societies, the memory of Sumerian kingship, rooted in the belief that power was a divine gift, continues to influence how we think about rulers and the systems they govern. In the end, the Sumerian king list is not just an ancient artifact. It is a window into the soul of early civilization. It shows us how humanity first grappled with the relationship between the divine and the mortal, and how that relationship shaped the very structure of society. The kings of Sumer, though mortal, were seen as the direct conduits between gods and men. Their reigns were part of a greater cosmic order that ensured the survival of humanity. And even as the gods withdrew, their influence remained in the hands of those chosen to rule, passing down a legacy that would stretch across time and continue to shape the world long after Sumer's rise and fall. As we continue to explore the legacy of Sumerian kingship and the divine mandate that once governed their society, it becomes increasingly clear that this ancient system was far more than a mere political structure. It was a worldview, a philosophy that intertwined governance, religion, and human existence in a way that has shaped not only ancient civilizations, but also modern ones in profound ways. The Sumerians, through the king list, didn't just craft a record of kings. They framed the very essence of authority and governance. Their kings, divine or divinely chosen, were seen not only as political leaders, but as spiritual figures, tasked with ensuring that cosmic order, the me, was maintained. This idea that kings were intermediaries between the gods and the people pervaded Sumerian society. It influenced not only their conception of kingship, but also the very foundation of their social, economic, and spiritual life. As the centuries passed and divine kingship began to fade in Sumer, this foundational understanding of leadership was carried forward into other great civilizations, continuing to shape the development of political and religious thought. In Egypt, for example, the concept of the divine king evolved but remained deeply rooted in Sumerian ideas. Pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, intermediaries between the heavens and the earth, ensuring that divine favor flowed to the people through their rule. While Egyptian pharaohs were not gods in the same sense that Sumerian kings were initially believed to be, they still embodied divine authority. This connection between kingship and the divine remained central to Egyptian governance for thousands of years. Likewise, in Babylon, the legacy of divine kingship continued to influence rulers such as Hammurabi, who famously codified laws that he claimed were given to him by the god Shamash. In the same way that the Sumerian king was seen as the enforcer of divine will, Hammurabi's legal code was presented as an extension of the divine order, ensuring that justice was meted out according to the will of the gods. The idea that the king was chosen by the gods, tasked with enforcing divine law, was a principle that transcended Sumer and became a central pillar of Babylonian society. But the true shift in kingship occurred when the divine authority of rulers became more symbolic and less literal. This is especially evident in the rise of empires like Rome. Roman emperors, though not considered gods in the same way the Sumerian kings or Egyptian pharaohs were still seen as divinely appointed. Emperors such as Augustus, who claimed a direct lineage to the gods, further cemented the idea that the emperor's power came from divine favor. However, by this point, the nature of kingship had changed. Roman emperors were no longer seen as the living embodiments of gods, but as their earthly representatives. Their divine mandate was more about maintaining the favor of the gods and ensuring the prosperity of the empire through their rule, rather than being viewed as divine beings themselves. In these later civilizations, the divine kingship of Sumer began to give way to a more secular understanding of power. Rulers no longer needed to be gods to rule. They simply needed to be seen as divinely chosen or favored by the gods. This shift marked the transition from rulers who were believed to be part of a divine order to those who were seen as political and military leaders, empowered by the gods, but not necessarily divine themselves. In this sense, the Sumerian legacy of divine kingship evolved into a more practical, politically oriented system, where divine authority was still invoked to legitimize power, but was no longer the cornerstone of a ruler's existence. This change didn't mean that the influence of the gods faded entirely from the rulers' lives. In fact, the gods remained a central part of royal legitimacy. From the Roman emperors who had divine favor to the monarchs of medieval Europe who claimed the divine right to rule, the connection between kings and gods continued to be a central theme in governance. Even in later periods, when monarchy became more symbolic, the notion that kings were chosen by the divine remained embedded in the cultural fabric of societies. The divine kingship of Sumer also had a significant impact on how later civilizations approached the concept of law. In Sumer, kingship and law were inseparable. The king's role was not just to rule, but to ensure that divine laws were enacted and that order and balance were maintained. This idea of law as a divine mandate carried over into Babylon with Hammurabi's code, which presented laws as handed down by the gods. Even in modern times, the idea of divine or natural law continues to influence legal systems, often serving as a moral foundation for societal governance. But even as the divine nature of kingship became more symbolic and humanized, its legacy endured. The Sumerians, through their king list, passed down an understanding of leadership that was fundamentally connected to the divine, a connection that was both revered and feared. While kings no longer claimed to be gods, the idea that their authority was granted by the divine continued to hold sway. This divine authority was not just a tool of governance, it was a tool of cultural identity. The kings, whether divine or mortal, were symbols of the unity between the divine and human realms. They were the embodiment of society's belief that the gods were still watching over them, guiding their fate through human hands. The decline of divine kingship did not mark the end of its influence. Instead, it opened the door for new ways of thinking about authority, governance, and the divine. As the ancient world evolved, so did the relationship between the rulers and the divine. Kings were no longer seen as gods, but were often seen as the instruments of divine will. This shift was pivotal. It laid the foundation for the modern concept of leadership as we understand it today. Leaders who, while not divine, are still expected to embody and enforce certain moral and spiritual values. Even in secular governments, the idea that leadership comes with a moral and spiritual responsibility endures. The legacy of Sumerian divine kingship has shaped not only how we think about kings and rulers, but also how we conceptualize justice, law, and the relationship between the divine and the human. In the aftermath of this monumental shift, humanity began to rely more on the structure of laws and political systems to govern itself. The idea of law as a divine commandment continued to permeate legal systems, but it was no longer tied to divine kingship in the same way. The king, once a god in human form, became a figure of mortal authority, tasked with enforcing the divine will through the laws and structures that sustained society. In this sense, humanity's move from divine kingship to mortal rule can be seen as the beginning of the modern era, a time when humanity took responsibility for its own destiny, guided not by the direct intervention of gods, but by the wisdom and structure of human institutions. Yet the legacy of Sumerian kingship still echoes through the halls of power, reminding us that the divine and the human were once deeply intertwined in the story of civilization. As we look at the political systems of today, we see the lasting influence of those ancient kings. Whether through the symbolism of authority, the concept of divine right, or the reverence for law, the Sumerian tradition has shaped how we view power, governance, and the connection between the divine and human realms. As we continue exploring the profound legacy of divine kingship and the transition from Sumer's ancient system to the more human-centered governance that followed, it's important to look at the deeper philosophical implications of this shift. The movement from kings as living gods to kings as mortal representatives of divine will not only shape the trajectory of Sumerian civilization, but reverberated through every culture that followed, influencing how political power, religious authority, and the relationship between humans and the divine would evolve for centuries. In Sumer, as we have seen, the king was more than just a ruler. He was the living embodiment of the god's will. His reign was not simply a political contract, it was a divine mandate. The king list, with its narrative of long reigns and divine selection, reflects the belief that kings were not chosen by men, but by the gods themselves. This sacred responsibility, imbued with divine power, ensured that the king had not only political authority but spiritual significance as well. The king's role was to uphold cosmic order, to enact the god's will on earth, ensuring peace, prosperity, and harmony for the people. But as the divine kingship of Sumer gave way to more humanized forms of governance, this essential spiritual and philosophical foundation was reinterpreted and adapted. The Sumerians' gods, who once directly governed the fates of rulers, retreated from direct intervention in the daily affairs of men. And yet, the idea that the king's authority was grounded in divine favor persisted. It was no longer the king who was divine, but his rule that was seen as divinely sanctioned. This change wasn't a rejection of the divine. It was a reconfiguration of how divine authority was channeled through the human world. This shift from divine kingship to mortal rule is a reflection of a broader change in how ancient cultures viewed the relationship between humanity and the divine. No longer were humans entirely beholden to the gods' direct control. They were still subject to the gods' will, but they were no longer passive recipients of divine intervention. They could act, choose, and govern in ways that reflected their own agency. Kings, though still regarded as divinely chosen, now had to prove themselves worthy of their role through their actions, their governance, and their ability to maintain order in their societies. This allowed for a new form of leadership, one where kings were not only political figures, but also moral and ethical guides, representing the best of human leadership in service to the gods. The evolution from divine kings to mortal kings is also a reflection of humanity's growing sense of self-determination. As the gods retreated, humanity had to reckon with its own destiny. The Sumerians, in their transition from divine kingship to mortal rulers, were learning to govern themselves, while the gods still played an important role in ensuring the prosperity and well-being of the people. Humans no longer saw themselves as entirely dependent on divine intervention. Instead, they saw themselves as participants in their own future, with the ability to shape their own lives, societies, and civilizations. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on how laws, governance, and justice were perceived. In Sumer, as in many ancient cultures, laws were not just human constructs. They were seen as divinely ordained. The king's role was to ensure that the will of the gods was carried out, especially when it came to maintaining law and order. The connection between the divine and the political was inextricable. But as humanity's understanding of itself evolved, so too did the idea of law. While laws were still seen as sacred, they were also viewed as human creations. Kings, no longer simply divine enforcers, were now tasked with creating just and fair laws that would guide their people. Hammurabi's code is a prime example of this evolution. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, famously codified laws that were said to be given to him by the god Shamash. These laws were not just divinely inspired, they were deeply human as well, reflecting the social and moral realities of Babylonian society. In this sense, Hammurabi's code marked the beginning of a new era in lawmaking, one where laws were not merely divine commands handed down from the gods, but were structured around the needs of society. Even though Hammurabi presented his laws as divinely inspired, they were clearly grounded in practical realities: justice, fairness, and the regulation of society's daily activities. Similarly, the Greeks, Romans, and other ancient civilizations followed this path of reinterpreting divine kingship into more human-centered systems of law and governance. In ancient Greece, rulers were often seen as divinely favored, but they were not considered gods themselves. The concept of democracy in Athens, though radically different from Sumer's monarchy, still reflected the belief that the gods had a hand in guiding the fate of the people. However, the Athenians believed that humans, through their collective wisdom, could and should govern themselves. This idea of self-governance, rooted in a belief in human agency, marked a significant departure from the divine kingship of the ancient Near East. In Rome, the emperor was often considered divinely chosen, but he was not a god in the same sense as the Sumerian kings. Roman emperors like Augustus used divine symbolism to legitimize their power, but their reigns were defined by more earthly concerns: military strength, political strategy, and the ability to maintain the empire's vast territories. This shift in how power was legitimized, moving from direct divine rule to a more political and military-based model, had lasting consequences. The emperor's divine right was no longer about his direct connection to the gods, but about his ability to govern effectively and maintain order. This evolution of divine kingship didn't simply mark a shift in political thought, it also reflected broader changes in religious belief. As the gods became more distant and abstract, people began to focus less on direct divine intervention and more on human agency, moral responsibility, and the pursuit of justice. The idea that the king or emperor was divinely chosen gave way to the belief that rulers should be judged by their actions and the well-being of their people. In the medieval period, the legacy of divine kingship was revived in a new form: the doctrine of the divine right of kings. This idea, which held that monarchs were appointed by God and were answerable only to him, can be traced directly back to the Sumerian belief that kings ruled by divine mandate. However, the difference in medieval Europe was that monarchs were seen as representatives of divine authority rather than gods themselves. The divine right of kings emphasized the sacred nature of royal power, but it was now framed as a moral responsibility to rule justly and according to God's will. The divine right of kings remained an important concept in European monarchies until the Enlightenment, when ideas about governance began to shift again. The rise of democratic thought and the questioning of absolute monarchy undermined the concept of the divine right. By the time of the French Revolution, the divine right of kings had been largely replaced by ideas of popular sovereignty and the consent of the governed. Nevertheless, the concept of divine kingship, which had been developed in Sumer, and passed down through the ages, continued to influence how people thought about rulers, justice, and the relationship between the divine and the earthly. Today, in secular societies, the legacy of divine kingship might seem distant or irrelevant, but its influence can still be seen in the way that modern leaders are often expected to embody certain moral values, guide their nations with wisdom, and maintain order in a chaotic world. The ancient concept of kingship, where rulers were seen as divinely chosen, still reverberates in the symbolic roles that modern political leaders play. Whether through the ceremonial duties of monarchs, the moral and ethical expectations placed on presidents, or the idea of leadership as a form of public service guided by higher principles, the essence of Sumerian divine kingship continues to shape how we view power and authority today. As we reflect on the long history of kingship and the way it evolved from Sumer's divine rulers to today's secular leaders, we are reminded that power, authority, and governance have always been intertwined with spiritual beliefs. The Sumerian king list offers us not just a record of kings, but a reflection of humanity's evolving understanding of its relationship with the divine and its own potential. In the end, the divine kings of Sumer may have faded, but their legacy lives on in the rulers of today. Their divine mandate, though no longer literal, continues to influence how we think about leadership, justice, and the responsibility that comes with power. As we continue the journey through the legacy of Sumerian divine kingship, it becomes increasingly evident that the transition from kings who were literal gods to kings who were mortal representatives of divine will was not just a political shift. It was a profound philosophical and cultural transformation that shaped how later civilizations would govern and understand the role of leadership. The kings of Sumer, with their direct connection to the gods, laid the groundwork for a new understanding of authority and power, a foundation that influenced the rise of future empires and continues to echo through the modern world. When we reflect on the Sumerian king list, it is clear that the first kings were not just rulers, they were divine beings, chosen by the gods to govern and maintain order in the world. Their long reigns, sometimes spanning tens of thousands of years, reflect a time when the gods were actively involved in human affairs. These kings, in essence, embodied the divine order and were seen as living gods themselves. The divine kingship was a system where political authority was inseparable from religious belief, and the king's role was to ensure that the cosmic balance, or me, was maintained. However, as time passed and the flood became a central event in Sumerian myth and history, the reigns of the kings began to shrink. No longer were kings granted supernatural lifespans. Instead, their reigns became more realistically human, often lasting only a few decades. This shift signaled a fundamental change in the relationship between humanity and the divine. The gods, once directly intervening in the lives of their people, began to withdraw from the earthly realm. Kings were no longer gods themselves, but they were still believed to be chosen by the gods to rule. They no longer embodied divine power directly, but their authority was seen as a reflection of the gods' will. This evolution from divine kingship to mortal rule represents a crucial turning point in human history. The gods may have receded, but their influence was far from gone. The kings of Sumer were still expected to fulfill a divine purpose, to maintain order, and to ensure that the gods' will was enacted through their rule. However, their authority became more symbolic, and their role as divine representatives was gradually replaced by their role as political leaders responsible for governing human affairs. In the wake of this transformation, humanity began to grapple with the reality of its own agency. The gods were no longer actively involved in the daily affairs of men, and the king's role as the intermediary between gods and humans shifted. Kings were still seen as divinely chosen, but now they were expected to prove their worth through their governance, their ability to maintain order, and their skill in ensuring the welfare of their people. The divine kingship that had once defined Sumerian society now gave way to a more human-centered approach to leadership. The king was no longer seen as a god, but as a mortal who had been granted divine favor and responsibility. This shift did not erase the concept of divine kingship, rather, it transformed it. The idea that kings were divinely chosen persisted, but their role evolved. As the Sumerians moved from divine kings to mortal rulers, they also began to rethink the nature of leadership. No longer was it enough for a king to be seen as divine. Now the king was expected to be a wise, just, and capable ruler, someone who could balance the needs of the people with the demands of the gods. In this new system, the king became a symbol of divine will, but also a figure who could govern through human effort and decision-making. This transition from divine kingship to mortal kingship was not unique to Sumer. As the Sumerians' influence spread through the ancient Near East, other civilizations adapted the concept of divine kingship to fit their own needs. In Egypt, for example, the divine king concept remained central to governance. Pharaohs were still regarded as gods on earth, embodiments of divine power. However, even in Egypt, the role of the king began to shift over time. By the New Kingdom period, the pharaohs were no longer seen as direct gods, but as the living representatives of gods, chosen to rule by divine will. This subtle change reflected the broader evolution of kingship in the ancient world, where the divine connection was increasingly symbolized rather than directly experienced. The same pattern can be observed in later civilizations like Persia and Rome. In Persia, kings like Cyrus the Great were still seen as divinely chosen, but their authority was more explicitly tied to their ability to maintain order, expand the empire, and secure the welfare of their people. Similarly, in Rome, emperors were often regarded as divinely appointed, but they were not seen as gods themselves. Instead, they were the mortal representatives of the gods, tasked with maintaining the favor of the divine and ensuring the prosperity of the empire. The shift from divine kingship to mortal rule in these civilizations was a continuation of the evolution that began in Sumer. However, as the divine kingship gradually receded, the influence of divine authority on leadership remained a central theme. Even as kings and emperors became more humanized, the idea that rulers were chosen by divine will continued to legitimize their authority. This connection between divine favor and political power persisted in various forms, from the divine right of kings in medieval Europe to the ceremonial roles of modern monarchs. The core principle that leadership carries with it a moral and spiritual responsibility remained deeply ingrained in the political culture of these societies. In medieval Europe, the concept of the divine right of kings emerged as a direct heir to the divine kingship of Sumer. Monarchs claimed that their authority to rule came directly from God, and their power was unquestionable because it was divinely granted. While the monarchs of medieval Europe were no longer gods themselves, their role as divinely chosen rulers was central to their legitimacy. This idea of divine authority persisted throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, even as political systems became more complex and power began to shift away from monarchs to parliaments and republics. In modern times, the idea of divine kingship has largely faded in the face of democracy and secular governance. However, the influence of this ancient system is still visible in the symbolic roles that monarchs play today. Even in constitutional monarchies, where kings and queens no longer wield political power, they remain symbols of national unity and continuity. Their ceremonial roles, steeped in religious symbolism, echo the ancient idea that the ruler represents the connection between the divine and the mortal realms. This enduring legacy of divine kingship is a testament to the profound influence that the Sumerian model of kingship has had on the development of political and religious thought. The transition from gods ruling through kings to human rulers chosen by the gods marks a pivotal moment in the history of civilization. It was a turning point that allowed humanity to evolve, not just as subjects of divine will, but as active participants in shaping their own destiny. The Sumerian king list may record the reigns of kings who lived thousands of years, but it also chronicles humanity's journey from divine servitude to self-determined governance. As we look to the future, we see that the core principles of divine kingship, responsibility, justice, and a moral mandate continue to inform our understanding of leadership. The legacy of Sumer, with its blend of the divine and the human, reminds us that leadership is not just about political power. It is about moral responsibility, about serving the greater good, and about ensuring that the will of the people is in harmony with the values and principles that guide our society. In this way, the kings of Sumer, though long gone, continue to shape the way we think about power, governance, and the connection between the divine and the earthly realms.